Serious, what is the most shocking thing someone confessed while on their deathbed? Me and all of my cousins were gathered around my grandfather's hospice bed as he lay dying. Each and every one of my cousins, there's a lot of us, gave him a kiss and tried to talk to him / said they loved him, etc. But he wouldn't respond to any of them, just stared. Until I came up. I sat on the edge of his bed, holding his hand. Everyone was watching us. He looked at me and said, "I don't like Mexican food." And that was it. Well, it was intended to be a deathbed confession, but she pulled through. My GF's mom told my GF her birth father's name, after saying she didn't know. She was whoring around and couldn't remember. It was Orange County in the 80s and apparently my future mother-in-law fucked and did drugs with most of the lowlifes in Southern California. But she did know who my GF's dad was and finally told her after 30 plus years. Turns out he now lived less than 3 blocks away in our small town in the Mojave Desert. His kids look exactly like my GF did at their age. We didn't make contact, as his criminal record is a mile long, and he's a shitty person by all evidence. My grandfather was in the hospital in a pretty nasty state. He barely could speak, but he made it clear to us he had something to say. He had my mother get him a piece of paper and a pen, thinking he has some important words to leave us with in case he doesn't have the chance later. My mom does just that. There's silence in the room as he scribbles something onto the paper, with my mother and her 2 siblings waiting in anticipation. My grandfather finishes, and with a big smile, turns the paper for us to see. "I've got a girlfriend." It read, as he pointed to Anna, a neighbor and friend of his. The goofball ended up pulling through and living several more years. My grandma confessed to my mom, when she thought she was dying, she got better, that she tried to coat her abort her. Obviously it was unsuccessful. My grandma was a religious woman and decided that God wanted her to have this baby and treated my mom like her favorite child. This messed my mom up for a while, and it was even more awkward when my grandma surprisingly got better. After grandma died for real, my mom eventually made peace with it. After she was born, grandma never treated her like she was unwanted, so mom understood she was in a vulnerable place at the time. Mom was the 7th child in a poor family. Yay, the time before birth control. My mother worked as a nurse in the biggest hospital in Copenhagen. A dude is terminally ill with cancer, has his wife, children and entire family next to him. He decides before he dies that he was gonna phone the girl he was cheating with on his wife to meet up at the hospital when the entire family was there. My mother had to move the entire family into another room when she showed up because of massive shouting and hysteria. What a selfish prick he was. My dad had an impacted bowel and was heavily medicated. Before he went in for exploratory surgery, he tried to write a letter to me expressing his feelings. He could barely talk before he went into surgery. He kissed me and had tears in his eyes knowing it was the end. The paper was folded and said on the front, "Only open if I die." While he was in surgery, I selfishly opened it. It was a few paragraphs of unreadable scribbles that I couldn't read. He made it through the surgery, but also got stiff, since the hospital sucked at washing him, so he was put into hospice, which is basically where you're put to die. I know this isn't quite that bad, but if he died, I'd never know what that note said, and it would weigh on me for my entire life. He later told me it probably said how much I loved you, and wish I did more for you or some shit. You know, dad stuff. He's the best. My mom told me about the death of her father, my grandfather, and his last words to her. She said he was on his deathbed, and it was obvious he was nearing the end. He motioned her over to tell her something. She went over, leaned in close, expecting some declaration of his love for her, or some deeply insightful. He said the good family silverware is hidden in the ventilation system about 15 feet out from the furnace. She looked at him, like he was crazy. He said, "What? We travel a lot and that's where I hid it. That shit's expensive." He died the next morning. My uncle confessed to being in the KKK and said he wasn't sorry for it. I told him that's okay, because I wasn't sorry he was dying. My grandmother was super religious my whole life. Always going to church and doing right by her community. In her last hour she said she really did not believe in God and wished she had not wasted all that time in her life doing what she thought others wanted her to do. It was pretty crazy for her husband, my dad, and aunt to hear her say that. My grandpa's brother died of Parkinson's a couple of years ago. He was on hospice and all his loved ones were there to comfort him before he passed. He was incoherent his last couple of days, but just before he died, he sat up, looked at an empty corner and said, "Mom, you came for me," laid back down, and died with a smile on his face. My great-grandma was definitely someone who would come help her child transition to the next world, if there is one. She was a great lady. My mum was from China, though we are now happily residing in an European country. We went back to China for my grandmother's last few weeks as she was dying from terminal cancer. On my grandma's last days, she requested that mum stay with her alone, and it was only then she revealed that my mum wasn't her biological kid. My grandma confessed that she has bought my mum from a child trafficking ring, which was common in China, because she had tried for many years and still couldn't get pregnant. My mother cried a lot, not only for the unimaginable pain that her biological parents likely went through in losing a baby, but also for the fact that my grandparents had went beyond to treat my mum as their little princess. They literally did treat my mum as their own. They were never abusive and only gave her the very best in life. They even willingly sent my mum to the US for university education, even though they aren't rich by any means. I'm a medical student, and I had a female patient who was new to our practice who was HIV positive. I needed to ask her how she got the virus, i.e. sexual or IV drugs. She tells me it was sexually transmitted, and the only reason she got tested was because her partner of 3 years' last words to her as he was dying in hospice was, I'm sorry, I wanted to tell you, forgive me." Heavy stuff. To be clear, he died of cancer, and not of AIDS. Some people believe it was AIDS that killed him, and my patient should have already known at this point. This was not the case. She has been positive for 20 years, no symptoms, and is undetectable. All her number are great. Medicine has come a long way and HIV does not equal a death sentence in most patients. I have a great aunt that passed away when I was 17. Just before she did, my older brother confessed to her that I was gay. She called me in and explained how our family has been through so much, and that she was willing to totally accept me for who I am. I think that is great of her to be that open-minded. Only one problem: I'm not gay. She never believed me, because my brother had confessed it. This was surprising to me, but more sad than anything. I was always close to my granny, but I never had the heart to tell her I'm gay, as I had only heard her say negative things before about homosexuality. I didn't want to upset her and cause family problems. Towards the end, she had suffered strokes and was unable to talk. My mother and uncle were in the hospital with her while she was dying. During this time, my uncle confessed to my mother that granny had always known I'm gay and that she didn't care and loved me. I regret not having the balls to tell her before she died. I have a good and a bad story for this thread. I'll start with the good. It's not exactly on the deathbed, but as close as she was able to at the time. My aunt had cancer. She knew she was going to die, and she knew it would probably be in less than a week. She couldn't eat, and drinking was hard. She wanted to be sedated heavily, kept asleep permanently, essentially, for the last few days, because this whole dying thing sucks, and I've had more than enough. So fair enough, a doctor is called up, a plan is made and carried out. The last thing my aunt said before going under for the rest of her life was, I see the stars, they're sweet and run carefree, gather them up. And that's when she went under. She died 3 days later. Nobody knows what she meant, but somehow, those last words fit her, so my uncle, her husband, got them tattooed on his chest, over his heart. The bad. My other uncle had been in a car accident. It was bad. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, he said, "Tell my wife that Wendy is my daughter, and I'll have her name changed for privacy." He died a few minutes later because of internal bleeding. Wendy was the neighbor's then 5-year-old child. That caused a huge shitstorm, I can tell you. I met a lady on a train to Edinburgh who was really nervous because she was on the way to meet her brother for the first time in 70 years. Her parents had told her that he died when he was 1, but they'd given him away because they couldn't afford so many kids. She didn't find out he was still alive until her mother confessed it on her deathbed.